Okay, here we are to do an American Revolution podcast. It's the first attempt at doing this, and it's for the second unit for the American Revolution OCR History A level. So my name's James Sharrett, and I'm the head of history at St. Charles Catholic Sixth Form College, and I also did a history degree at UCL and a master's at the Institute of Study of the Americas, specializing in American history. And my colleague is...
Hi, my name's Peter Wilkin. I'm based in Australia. In Australia, talking about American history. I did a PhD in the US. I studied American politics. Did a bit of American history. Yeah, that qualifies me, I think.
Yeah, so I'm going to lead it off, obviously, because I'm teaching this course anyway. So we're going to alternate depending on the different topics. So I'm just going to go through the different acts and the different acts leading up to the causes of the American Revolution, why they're important, why they aren't. Peter's going to come back with a little bit of what he thinks the importance of that act is, and then we'll debate that a little bit, go through all of them, and then we'll go on to the Diamond Nine, of which we think is most important and why, and debate on that, see if we have differences of opinion or similar opinion on it. And then we're going to debate the essay on the underlying causes, whether it was underlying causes, British actions or American actions that were the most important reason why the revolution happened. So I'll kick it off with the Proclamation Act. The Proclamation Act was passed in 1763. Obviously, the key to this was the end of the 7 Years' War. The end of the 7 Years' War removed the French presence on the continent. So a lot of people said that was a war that the British won, and in winning it, they lost the continent, because removing the French removed the biggest fear factor for the colonists. And also, there was a natural problem that the Americans then believed, with the French gone, they would be free to expand over the whole of the continent. And for them, it was obvious that the continent was theirs. And the Americans, especially following Pontiac's rebellion in 1763, the British were worried about American expansion into Native American lands, also lack of control, and the potential conflicts that would come there. Other problems that came out at the end of the 7 Years' War, obviously, was the increased debt that the nation had to pay off, and they needed to look for a way to pay it. The British were struggling under taxes, so they thought the Americans should pay for their own defense, and the need for an army to be put on the western frontier if they were going to stop expansion into the Native American territories. So with that as the background, and after Pontiac's rebellion, the Proclamation Act was passed in 1763. Obviously, it's important because it was designed to stop westward expansion into the new lands after the war. Now, this would have upset the colonies in general, because they wanted to have that ability to expand into new land, especially like the southern colonies and the colonies with western boundaries. Obviously, New England colonies weren't particularly keen on the southern colonies expanding into the west, because they would have been able to get more land, more influence, because obviously the New England colonies didn't have boundaries with that region. And that ability to surge westward was why a lot of the elites bought land in that area, including George Washington, Patrick Henry, and John Lawrence, who were all significant in the Revolution. So a lot of elites bought land in that area. So the fact the Proclamation Act said they could not cross the Appalachian Mountains, they could not go into the West, alienated a lot of people who'd bought that land. I often wonder if Patrick Henry's Virginia Resolves 2 years later didn't have something to do with the fact he couldn't access his land in the West properly anyway. That restriction frustrated the Americans. Admittedly, mostly Virginians, and especially like rich landowners who thought they would be able to expand their territory in the South, and obviously cash crops in the South as well. And that expansion would be one of the problems that would lead to the tensions on slavery later on, about whether the new states would be slave owning or not. And they also decided to deploy a standing army, because obviously they sent 10,000 men to the western border in order to, in theory, or what the British said was to protect them from Native American incursions and to stop the settlers from crossing the line. But a lot of the settlers viewed it as tyrannical, because it was an army deployed in peacetime, and they saw it as a potential threat to them, and that it was being used to control them rather than to protect them. And obviously, the other factor of deploying a 10,000-man army on the western frontier is you need money to pay for them, and that necessity would mean that the British would have to tax them in some way or raise that funding somehow. And they thought it was only natural that if it was defense for the Americans, then they should pay for their own defense, and it shouldn't be the British that were paying for it. And of course, this is kind of starting to be the end of salutary neglect. So the Americans had long thought they were free to run their own affairs, but Britain had just kind of allowed that to happen, because over 3,000 miles away, it's difficult to control directly. So they were like, well, we will allow the Americans to kind of run their own affairs. But at this point, they started to to assert their control on the continent. And the Americans saw that as a change in the situation, whereas the British saw it as a continuation of what they'd always had the power to do. They just hadn't necessarily done it. And one of the reasons why the Proclamation Act is not so significant is it didn't affect all the colonists. Obviously, those who didn't have land and those not on the western border were less impacted by it than others. And also, it wasn't really enforced because it was almost impossible to stop colonists from swarming over. So a lot of them went west anyway, and it didn't really affect them. So, like I said, I'm just going to set up the main facts. Peter, do you want to come in with how significant do you think the Proclamation Act was?
Sure. I put it right at the bottom and debated with myself whether to include it at all.
Yeah.
It didn't impress me as being very particularly significant, mainly for reasons of enforcement. But these things are tricky because there's the actual intention of the act on the one hand, and then there's the impression of it on these, excitable American colonists. I think the prospect of having a standing army, however, big that army was. I think how much was only 10,000 troops.
Yeah, 10,000 troops they sent across. So which was like they'd had 25,000 over there for the 7 Years' War, and then they sent just 10,000 across the police border.
And these troops are spread out, and they're mostly, I think, either in little forts along the
in the valleys, I think near Ohio
borders.
Valley and like New York Valley and along the Appalachian Mountains themselves. So not in the actual colonist.
So it's not like the Quartering Act later on when you have this problem of actually stationing British troops in the cities. I thought not in the scheme of things, maybe a kind of beginning of tensions, but nothing big yet.
Yeah, I think on the practical sense, you're right, because they crossed it, they ignored it. So it didn't really have any practical implications. But do you think the fact that it's symbolically the first removing of the idea of salutary neglect is important, or do you think that doesn't really kick in until the Stamp Act?
The idea of what, sorry?
Salutary neglect, the idea that they would be able to run them, that the British had kind of ignored them, hadn't really enforced anything upon the Americans. And this was so they thought they could run their own kind of affairs. And this is the first time where that kind of changes.
Yeah, I think you could make a case that that's significant. But I guess we'll see in relation to the other acts.
Yeah.
The other events that happen afterwards. So
yeah, I'll cover then three small ones that I'll cover together, which were passed in 1763, 64. So it's mostly after the which is the anti-smuggling legislation, the Sugar Act and the Currency Act. So I think they're less significant than the other ones, but each of them impacts a different community. So it's the idea of the piecemeal community act, I think, because the Proclamation Act impacts obviously landowners in the West. And then these other three target specific places. The anti-smuggling legislation was brought in because the British or the Americans had been smuggling a lot, especially into Boston. I think that's significant for later. They've been smuggling in rum from the Dutch and the French Caribbean because it was cheaper. No, sorry, sugar, molasses to make rum, rather. And they, because under mercantilism and the Navigation Acts, they were not allowed to trade with non-British Empire colonies, but they could obviously make a lot of money by bringing up something cheaper and enforcing it. And the smuggling had been going on for a long time, and there was a lot of bribing of local officials. Yeah. The anti-smuggling acts were kind of designed to stop that by making the fine £500, which was something that no one could really afford, and then by taking the Vice Admiralty Court up to Halifax, Nova Scotia. Now I think that's quite significant because they could bribe a lot of local officials, and the British knew that. So taking up to Halifax, Nova Scotia, which was a big naval base for the British, allowed them to make it more difficult for the locals to bribe because they didn't have any local contacts up there. But I think that moving the court up to Nova Scotia put it really close to Louisbourg in Quebec. And I think that's quite symbolically significant for the Americans, that when they think they're being denied a basic right, which is the right to a free trial, and that they've taken that up to an area that was in French Quebecois territory where trial by jury wasn't a thing. I think symbolically for the Americans made it feel like they were being strangled. So I think these like little legislations in a row had that impact. And the Sugar Act then as well built on that in 1764 by reducing the tax on sugar from 6p to 3p, which theoretically should make the colonists happy because they're paying less tax. The only difference being that now it's enforced and now they have to pay it. So it's the difference again between paying a 6p tax that is not enforced, it's not a real tax, versus paying a 3p tax that is actually collected. And now if you don't pay it, then there's a £500 fine and you're taken to Halifax, Nova Scotia, where you can't bribe the justices. So I think, and again, that had a massive impact upon Boston and the merchants because they're no longer able to smuggle. So you've got, and smugglers and merchants are well connected and well financed, I think. So therefore, annoying that group of people, they have a lot of influence in the colonies. And it's not coincidental that Boston is like one of the kickoff points for most of the troubles, when a lot of these early acts, I think, were impacting them to alienate them. So you've alienated people with land on the Proclamation Act, you've alienated people who are smuggling, you've alienated businesses on the rum trade in New England. And then the Currency Act doesn't allow them to print money, which you can see again why the British are doing it, because they're like, well, it's leading to inflation, it's causing problems, and British merchants were complaining they were being paid for, goods were being paid for in paper money. But the inability to print money kind of hurts debtors, whereas the Sugar Act and anti-smuggling legislation effectively hurts creditors, because most of the merchants would have been the creditors at the time. So although none of these things in themselves impacted the massive communities, the fact that each one of them impacted a different community, I think, was starting to build resentment. And I wonder if it also shows that the early resistance against like the British was economically driven and not ideologically driven, because all of these are targeting different economic interests. And I don't think the ideology really kicks in until after the Stamp Act. What do you think? Any of these that you think that are important or have any significance?
Yeah, I think what's interesting, I think you mentioned in the Sugar Act, it was actually a reduction, right? You said six shillings?
6p down to 3p.
6p. Yeah, we used to have the imperial system over in Australia. Yeah. 6p to 3p. That doesn't sound very much. And probably from the point of view of British MPs, they would think, well, what's the big deal? I mean, this is, after all, if you look at things on paper, if you look at the law on the books, these changes don't seem to be particularly dramatic in terms of responsibilities to pay. It's not a lot of money talking about. But there's obviously this incredible difference between what people think, what members of parliament think is going on in the Americas, and what is actually going on in the Americas.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's actually one of the really important elements of misunderstanding, or this sort of fog of war, this lag between knowing exactly what's happening in the colony, which is, how long would it take to get a message across? I mean, there's just
3 months back and forth, I think, something like that, because it was the ships in those days. It took about, so they were always about 3 months behind the events, at least 3 to 6 months behind.
I didn't think those things were as important as later things that happened.
Yeah, that's why I left them off the table. But do you think it matters who it impacts, as in like the different groups that it was impacting? Do you think that would have made a difference?
I think that's good. I think the Currency Act affected some colonies more than others. I think there were differences in the use of paper money. I remember Virginia was particularly affected by the Currency Act, but then there were other colonies where it wasn't.
Would make sense. So, considering Virginia was the one who kicked up after the Stamp Act anyway. So.
Yeah, right. And likewise with the anti-smugglings, the anti-smuggling laws, it's interesting to think that there's a kind of de facto way things are being done in the colonies, dodging of taxes. Again, the change of the status quo, I think, is going to anger the colonists in ways that the British aren't going to anticipate.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that statutory, like the salutary neglect, the end of it is really key, because that, like I said, the British just think they're asserting a right they've always had.
Exactly.
Because they think Parliament is superior to the colonial assemblies. And the Americans just assumed this was how it was always going to be. And so
Yeah.
for them, like these taxes are a revolutionary thing for them. They're like,
Yeah.
you're imposing a tax on your parliament over our parliaments when only our parliaments can tax us. And I think the fundamental difference is the British just see, well, as they should do, Parliament being above the colonial assemblies because it has superiority after the Civil War. And the Americans still see their colonial assemblies as equal to Parliament, as just another Parliament. So for them, I think, say for Virginia, the idea of Parliament taxing them is the same as if New York's assembly had just taxed them. And they're like, what are you doing? You're outside of your jurisdiction. Because I don't think the Americans quite understood what had happened in the British Civil War. And I don't think they understood that the king was no longer the highest point, Parliament was. And that Parliament no longer saw itself as the Parliament above parliaments, whereas the Americans saw it as a Parliament equal to the other parliaments.
Yeah, so this was actually, I think, one of the insights I got reading the history book was the fact that politically everybody's a Whig, right?
Yeah.
Like in the colonies, everybody's a Whig.
Yeah.
Obviously, Parliament is now in control of affairs after 1688. But there is this massive lag. There's a different kind of understanding of the relationship between the executive, between Parliament. And what I mean is that the colonists, I think, were Whigs of the pre-1688 type.
Mm-hmm.
So the way that they view politics is through the lens of the English before 1688, which is the fear of tyranny, extreme sensitivity to any kind of infraction of public liberty, right? And all of that stuff made sense. Like if you read the history of obviously Charles II, the latter Stuart monarchs, and all of the turmoil that took the country through, you can kind of understand where all of that anxiety is coming from. But it's interesting that I think, basically in the Americas, in North America, I should say, Whigs are still in that mindset, the pre-1688 mindset. Whereas
you want to elaborate that? What do you think changed in the mentality between pre-1688 and post-1688?
I think that that Parliament essentially won the contest in 1688. Of course, the Glorious Revolution. They have William of Orange. His power, the powers of the executive of the King of England, are now limited, right, by a Bill of Rights. And so the people that were the Whigs that were clamoring against arbitrary power before 1688, they have essentially won. They've won the political fight. They're now in a position to be more conservative because they're actually in control, right? So it's now Parliament that's the center of legislation. That's all of that's happening. Whereas I think in America, it's almost as if the British Parliament is like what earlier Englishmen thought of Charles II and James I and James II. I think that's an odd disjunction. I think it's a really interesting time lapse, and it's not surprising because in colonies often the people in the colonies have a mentality that's somewhat dated, right? And the mother country kind of moves on.
Do you think also it's also partially due to the fact that a lot of them went out to America before the Civil War, and also
absolutely, 100%,
and also that a lot of them left
100%.
fleeing religious persecution as well.
Absolutely, yeah, and that was all part of it, right? Because the Stuarts, they were Catholics, essentially, right?
Yeah.
So there was all of this tremendous anxiety, and the the Puritans, the more extreme Protestants, many of them left. And they're now they're there among the colonists in the 13 colonies. So,
yeah,
I think that's a really important piece of context just to keep in mind for future events when things start running their course.
Yeah, I think it's like reenacting a lot of the fears from the Civil War. It's like they see it like shadows of the British Civil War in this.
Yeah.
Because I suppose technically this is a civil war. I mean, it's good at the American Revolution, but in reality, it is a
Yeah.
civil war.
I think, sorry, just one other thing
Yeah.
that's interesting is that there's also a massive asymmetry of power, right,
Yeah.
between Britain and the 13 colonies. And obviously, Britain is at this stage, um, you know, one of the greatest European powers. It's got a massive navy. It's got interests on the continent. It's got interest everywhere.
It's the
And
global
it's not as if,
superpower after the Seven
yeah,
Years' War.
yeah, right. So it's not that it's easy to think that the War of Independence or the rebellion of the colonies was some kind of really massive event, shattering event for England. But I'm not sure that's the case. I just think it's one problem among many. It's one interest among many interests that England has. Whereas from the point of view of the colonists, obviously, it's everything. It's extremely important.
Yeah.
Um, so anyway, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's really
things.
important when we get to like why they won the war, but we'll use that in unit.
Yeah.
I think that's definitely sets
Okay, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So I'll go on to the next one. So the next act then they passed obviously was the Stamp Act of 1765. And to give the background to that one. That was obviously designed to raise money to pay for the army, although it never actually, none of these taxes, none of the things the British imposed ever raised enough money to pay for what they were supposed to pay for. This fundamentally for me is one of the weaknesses of it, because I'm like, it feels like, with the exception of possibly the Stamp Act, especially the Townsend duties, feel like an attempt to impose authority on the Americans rather than actually achieving anything. But the fundamentals of the Stamp Act was they gave a year's advance warning that it was coming, which was perhaps a mistake because it gives obviously the colonists a chance to build up their resistance to it. And it taxed paper, which of course is used by everyone literate or intelligent or like articulate in the colonies. So, and especially obviously is going to impact newspapers and lawyers to a large degree. And I think if you give lawyers and newspaper printers a year's advance warning, you're going to tax them heavily. They're obviously going to use that time to whip up resistance. So I think this was the first time. All the other ones had targeted economic interests. It targeted merchants, people printing money, like sugar, rum producers, people who bought land. But this is the first time they've attacked the intellectual classes. And I think that's why it's for the first time you see a kind of intellectual justification to resistance and an ideological one, as opposed to just a pure economic resistance. Obviously, the resistance came with it was considered to be the first proper internal tax, which was a problem because they believed only the colonial assemblies had the right to internally tax them. So this is where that first initial real conflict between is Parliament superior to the assemblies or are they equal comes in. Patrick Henry passes the Virginia Resolves, which is the first recognized time of someone using the terminology of no taxation without representation. So that comes in here. I'm still wondering if Patrick Henry was influenced by the fact he couldn't access his land 2 years earlier from the Proclamation Act, but you never know. Let's just say he was ideologically moved. Led to the Stamp Tax Congress. Really important because that was the first time all of the colonies came together to resist something since the Albany Congress. And that obviously builds the connections for the later resistance and the unity of the 13 colonies, which is really important. Samuel Adams sets up the Loyal Nine in Boston, which become the Sons of Liberty. And this is vitally important because the Sons of Liberty burn effigies of the governors. There's civil disobedience. There's burning down of houses, intimidation. And so, of course, most of the people collecting the taxes resign and nobody wants a job because it's now dangerous. And the Sons of Liberty would go on to be really important in the Boston Tea Party and in later positions as well. So resistance, physical resistance comes this time. So there's a stronger resistance from it, I think. It eventually gets repealed after all this resistance because no one wants to collect it and the British government changes. I think a fundamental problem here as well, you've got a lot of changes of British governments between those who were sympathetic to the Americans and those who were not. And so there was a constant inconsistency, which I don't think the Americans really understood and they just saw it as they won. But I think fundamentally for the Americans, it's less significant this one maybe because it was eventually repealed. So the fact that it was repealed meant that the British should back down. And the fact that the British should back down meant the Americans, I believe, thought that if they resisted another time, they would be able to do this. And I think backing down the first two times from the British set them up into a difficult position later on, because the Americans are like, if we just push hard enough, they will back down. Also significant that Edmund Burke and William Pitt was on the side of the colonists on the Stamp Act. So both of them, highly influential figures in British Parliament, believed that the Americans had a point when they said no taxation without representation. They were not represented in Parliament, and therefore they should not be taxed. And this was that Pitt and Burke were on their side all the way until the Boston Tea Party, and we'll talk about that later. But the Boston Tea Party, when they threw the tea in the harbor, for them it no longer became about taxation; it became about destruction of property. And so that's why the Boston Tea Party is significant, because people who supported them in Britain beforehand, and there were a lot of people who supported them in Britain, saying these are British citizens, these are British rights, they have the right to do this, turned sides afterwards. And another thing it showed was that Gates had said you need to have a massive army to crush this resistance, and the British were unwilling to do it. So it shows even early on that they were unwilling to use the necessary force to crush this, that they probably would have done if it was a different colony. Like, I think if in their non-British colonies, I think the British would have crushed this resistance. And the fact they didn't suggests that there's a different attitude towards people they consider to be British citizens. And lastly, I think the last significance of the Stamp Act is it led to the Declaratory Act of 1766. Now, I think the Declaratory Act is fundamentally important. When they repealed it, they brought in the Declaratory Act at the same time. And the Declaratory Act said, we still have the right to tax you. And I think that this fundamentally illustrates that the key point now for the government after this was less the money and more the idea of we need to assert Parliament's superiority over the colonial assemblies, because we cannot have colonies resisting in this way. Yeah. So what do you think? How important was the Stamp Act?
Yeah, I actually put it at the top.
Yeah.
Like I at number one. I think I put it at the top of my pyramid. I thought that unlike the other, like the Proclamation Act or the Currency Act, I think the Stamp Act represents a watershed moment from the point of view of the colonists.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the no taxation without representation rallying cry, although maybe it began in the Sugar Act, so it has a precursor. I think that it really gains momentum under the Stamp Act. The fact that they repealed the Stamp Act, I think the fact that they repealed the Stamp Act is actually proof of how important the Stamp Act was.
Yeah, go on. Why?
And what's that?
I said why. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I think that the outcry against it, and the fact that Parliament, although there's an element of chance too, because if I recall, there was a change of leadership between the Stamp Act and the Proclamation Act. Am I right? Correct with that one?
Yes.
Does my memory serve me well?
Yeah, they changed multiple times in Britain over this period as well, and that was a change.
So we have
the
Earl of Rockingham.
Yeah,
we have the Earl of Rockingham. So there's, you can't underestimate the degree of chance that happens in these events. Maybe they would have stuck to the Stamp Act if that hadn't happened. But I think that there's two kinds of main colonial anxieties, I think, in my opinion. I think one is that no taxation without representation, and then the argument that there's an intention to tyrannize over the colonies. Right? And I don't think either of those things are actually true in an objective sense.
Yeah.
But I think that's how many of the colonists, especially the more radical ones, felt. So so I think I put the Stamp Act up there as. Do you
not see the Declaratory Act though as an attempt to enforce that over the top? Because I think the Declaratory Act almost in a way raises that fear of despotism almost more than the Stamp Act does, because it has no point other than saying we're superior.
Right, but I think you could read the Declaratory Act in a couple of ways, right? Because on the one hand, you could think it's an an assertion of parliamentary authority that over the colonial legislatures. On the other hand, you can view it as an admission of weakness, which is sort of the way I take it.
Okay.
I think that they needed some face-saving measure after repealing the Stamp Act, because that's a tremendous thing, right? You're a teacher, right? In class, if you set a rule for the students,
yeah,
and then all the students muck up,
yeah,
and then you say, "Oh, okay, I take back the rules."
Yeah, the authority
but I have the authority over you.
Yeah, you're dead. You're dead.
Yeah, exactly.
From that moment on, if you give an instruction, and I assume my students will laugh now because they're listening to it. If you give an instruction and you don't follow through, then your authority is gone. Like, you don't have it. So that's why, like, even if you don't want to do, that's why I'm very careful what I threaten, because it's like, even if you don't want to, you have to enforce it, otherwise you've got bigger problems.
But exactly, this is the problem, though.
So you see, this is like a naughty class. The Americans are like a naughty classroom.
Exactly, that is exactly my analogy. They're like a class of naughty kids. They're acting up.
Yeah.
And the teacher doesn't have I don't know how to put it. Doesn't have it doesn't. I was going to say doesn't have the stones. I guess that's not the correct thing. It's not. Yeah, it doesn't have the assertiveness to lay down the law.
Yeah.
And I think if the British had a higher, greater military presence, then it might be a different story. But in fact, you're really irritating these colonists, and you have very, very weak enforcement mechanisms. That's a bad combination.
Yeah, but that's what I mean. That's why I said, it's like Gates said, we need a big army if you want to crush this down. Do you think they even if they'd had the army, that they would have used it against British citizens?
I think quite possibly. I certainly think that if they had if they had more troops, they may well have been able to crush the rebellion in its initial phases. I think that's a distinct possibility.
Do you think that's not why the Americans are legitimate? Like, it's legitimate for them to be afraid of the 10,000 troops on the border on the Proclamation Act?
Well, it proves that I mean, I think it's the idea of a standing army that's more important than the fact of a standing army.
Yeah.
Because in British history, a standing army, this is to get back to my previous point about the pre-1688 Whigs. So a standing army, a pre-1688 standing army, is basically a tool that the attempt of a tyrannical monarch, like a Stuart king, to essentially strong-arm Parliament, force them to accept the king's measures, dissolve them at the king's will. It's that historical memory, I think, that's much more significant than the actual facts on the ground.
Yeah. Do you think the Americans are basically 100 years behind in how they're viewing it?
Basically, yeah.
And that the British don't understand this, so they don't accommodate it. But that's why
because because they've won. They've basically, this contest is over in England, decisively. And the people that and the Whigs that won, they're now in a position. They're in the Conservative position. They have to now consolidate their authority. They're not clamoring against. They are the ones now who are in the position of, well, I won't say the monarch, but Parliament, of course, is now really the supreme power.
Yeah.
So
the other question is, did they really want representation? Could they really want representation? Because I think from my memory reading it at uni, it was like the British understood that if they gave Americans representation in Parliament, then eventually they would be dominated, because America's a bigger continent. They were going to have a bigger population. They knew the population was going to outgrow them. If they were represented, the British would become a subjugated, 51st state of the United States. Whereas the Americans didn't want it, because sending a few people across the sea 3 months each way is not really going to be very beneficial, and yet that would allow the British to justify the taxation they were putting on them. So I don't think either side really wanted it.
I see it a little differently. So I think that